All right, so I think we have enough people here. I'll introduce Tom, and then Tom is going to do the talk. So Tom Connolly is our conservation chair, and he also just became the secretary of the club this year at the AGM. And Tom's been on the board for at least 2 years, maybe three now. And he's been
From
doing
the early
some,
days of COVID, anyway.
yeah, early days of COVID.
In fact, I think I joined just before COVID. So
Yeah, so he steered us through the whole COVID and the government and health, all that stuff with the waivers and COVID clicking buttons and whatever. So that was really good because we had to, update all our paperwork for in-person events. Anyways, Tom's been doing some great work on the conservation side. Every month or two, some member comes to us with some concern, and we, kind of lean in and try to help whatever that concern is. It could be a portage, access point, a portage somewhere up north that somebody's concerned with. There's a lot of activities we get involved with, but Tom's been spearheading that. So if anybody's interested in any conservation activities, Tom's the man to talk to. He'd love to have you help out on some stuff. So Tom, I'm going to hand it over. And maybe
I'd even welcome a co-chair for the Conservation Committee.
Yeah.
If that gets anybody excited. Thank you, Gary, and thanks for this opportunity. I'm going to talk about the Lower Don Valley today, and specifically a recent episode involving Metrolinx. It's been going on for the last few years. And then, unlike so many Metrolinx projects, this one came to or at least this sort of aspect of it came to an abrupt and satisfactory end. So that's a little bit of a spoiler, but what Metrolinx had been planning was to put a facility in the Lower Don, and I'll show you on the map where it is. I don't know, maybe some of you aren't in Toronto, maybe you're not familiar with Toronto, but the Don River, and I'll show the maps of this, is one of our rivers, one of a number of rivers running through Toronto, characterized by majestic valleys and ravines. And anyway, so let me get on with this. Gary thought this would be a good talk because it is it may hold some lessons about wading into a conservation, project, but it's certainly of interest because I know so many people over the years with the WCA are familiar with the Don River. So let me share my screen. I will go through my presentation hopefully quickly, and I'm happy to take questions along the way. Does that work?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, very good. Anyway, so going to bat for the Lower Don Valley is the title of this. I guess, many people have gone to bat for the Don Valley over at least, 100 years maybe, starting with people like Ernest Thompson Seton and Charles Soriel, but more recently, since in the 80s in particular, but we'll get onto that, there's been a whole lot of effort to renaturalize the Don and to recover, sort of deindustrialize it, and this is perhaps the latest skirmish in that. I've been involved with a group, a very informal group, and we call ourselves Build the Park. It's one of a number of sort of umbrellas that have attracted activists, just to name a few others that some may have heard of. Well, residents associations have gotten involved. I want to give credit to the people over at Chester Hill on the east side of the valley who showed a lot of leadership on the layover issue from the outset, which was about 2020 when the details were really put forward. You've got other organizations like A Park for All. You've got Don't Mess with the Don. Then you've got outfits like Toronto Field Naturalists and Toronto Nature Stewards, all of whom show great interest in the Don. I think you've got similar groups, Pick a Ravine across Toronto, and no doubt natural areas in other cities, you have people going to bat for them. So you have the Humber, you have the Rouge, and you have lots of other places like Smalls Creek. Anyway, I'm just going to give you my sort of observations about this episode, and I'm not sure what the lessons are, but I think if there's one lesson that I took from this is that if you just sort of feel strongly about something and put up your hand, you never know what might happen. Because I'm still as surprised as anybody that Metrolinx announced their change of plans. I thought that what we would have heard was Metrolinx announcing that the chainsaws were coming out, you know, tomorrow or something. You know, if you'd asked me a month ago what would be more likely to happen, I would have said that, but that's not what happened. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands of the Don River Valley, also known as the Wanscotinach lands, are part of the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and are now home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As members of the Wilderness Canoe Association, we affirm our respect for the natural environment embodied in Indigenous traditions, knowledge, and stewardship as a path towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The WCA also acknowledges the treasured cultural gifts of canoes and canoe routes that originated with Indigenous peoples all across this land. We join in the celebration and stewardship of these gifts as part of a shared journey towards reconciliation. Now, here's what I'm going to cover in the presentation, but I have a guest speaker to offer some comments on the background of the Wilderness Canoe Association and the Don River. So I'm going to invite Bill King just to spend a couple of minutes or however long you'd like to take, just some with some comments from his experiences going to bat for the Don. You're on mute.
Thank you, Tom. I should probably start by saying I live less than 200 meters from the Upper Don River and have for 50 years. I taught my boys to paddle whitewater on the very, very gentle rapids of the Upper Don River. So I have a personal connection with the Don that goes back a very long way. This all came about essentially because Bill Ness sent me a copy of a congratulatory email that he sent to Tom about Metrolinx's decision to back off from putting their station in the Don Valley. I was aware of that, but I hadn't been aware of the fact that the WCA was a leading force in the opposition. So congratulations, Tom, from me as well. I responded to Bill's email, which also inquired whether hadn't my wife Joan and I been involved with the Don for some time, with a rather chatty email, which was not really intended to be a history of the Don by any means, but it somehow seems to have got morphed into that. Anyway, yes, we were involved with the Don for a long time. In the, I think, middle 1980s, the Conservation Authority decided to set up a task force to look at reclamation of the Don in so much as it was necessary. As with most of these things, the appointees were widespread. It was a group, I would think, of 30 or more people. It included pretty much all of the politicians along the Don watershed, which extends through quite a number of political jurisdictions, one of which was that of my wife Joan, who was the, I think, either North York or Metro councillor for this area at the time. So I managed to get involved with it by applying with no particular credentials other than the fact that I like to canoe on the Don. And I think because, in part, the chairman of the Conservation Authority at the time was also a canoeist, I got appointed to the committee. Anyway, we did the things that committees do. Joan's contribution to the process was vastly greater than mine. We, in the culmination, produced a report, 40 Steps to a New Dawn, which I think came out in about 1991 or 92, and is doubtless collecting dust on a shelf somewhere at this point. At any rate, they were looking for some way to publicize the release of the report, and we suggested reviving what was called originally Paddle Down the Don, when George Lusty organized it back in the early 70s and got rechristened as Don River Day. I think the initial event was 92. I stand corrected, perhaps, but it was potentially a disaster. We were people of all skill levels and equipment levels were paddling from Serena Gundy Park down the Don to Harborfront, and across the harbor to Harborfront. The weather was brutal. It was early April on my suggestion to get the spring runoff, and let's put it this way, people were ill-equipped for it, and we were very lucky that nobody died of hypothermia. The event went on for many years thereafter. Gary James, among others, was very actively involved in organizing it in the latter stages. My original contribution was just to volunteer the Wilderness Canoe Association to provide the expertise to act as safety crews at the 3 weirs on the river, one of which in particular, the upper one, which is still there, was rather dangerous and had resulted in the 70s in the death of a father and son duo who, well after the event that George Lusty had organized, went over the weir and drowned in the reversing wave at the bottom. So I don't think that the WCA's contribution in that regard, which went on for a great many years, was insignificant in any respect, although the bureaucrats got a great many other people from the Harbor Patrol to the Coast Guard involved in subsequent years. In any event, that's my history with the Don. It went off. It went on for a great many years. I'm not sure whether it ever survived the pandemic. Gary could probably help us with that, but I don't think that there's been a Don River Day since 2019. But I stand corrected.
I believe that's correct. Yeah.
And it became it became probably the second major fundraising event for the Conservation Authority. So it had multiple benefits in addition to whatever we contributed to rehabilitating the Don.
Yeah, no, I understand that currently there's no plans to resurrect it or to resume it. I could be wrong. It was put on by the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, TRCA, and recently with Manulife sponsorship. But one thing I heard was that the liability issues were weighing on them. Anyway, that's all I know right now. But thank you for that. Just one final little chapter. We did the WCA outing on the Don in October of last year, and part of it was to just give everybody an appreciation of a nice little paddle, a nice outing. We saw some of the things, historical and future things going on, but there's also a secondary motive, which was to document the fact that it was a navigable river, in the belief that maybe a permitting issue could be raised in the process of discussing the Metrolinx plans, because as soon as it's a navigable river and you're working on crossings, it raises certain permitting issues. So anyway, so that was a bit of just a card in the back pocket, even though not the Don isn't particularly critical as a commercial navigable route since about 1880, I don't think. Thank you very much, Bill. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Here's a map of the Don River watershed. It's 36,000 hectares. You can vaguely see the lower Don is circled, and then you see the East Don branch and the West Don heading up north towards the moraine. The Oak Ridge's moraine. On the sidebar there, you also see some of the successive steps. Bill alluded to 40 steps to a new Don. Perhaps a critical event in the sort of recovery of the Don was, I believe, in 1969, one of the environmental groups actually had a funeral for the Don because things had gotten so bad. So they declared it deceased, and I think that brought public attention to the fact that we could do a lot better. So that's a little bit of the history of successive blueprints for measures that should be taken to restore it as an environmental treasure in our midst, parkland, natural habitat, and so on. This is an up-close view of the so-called lower Don, which is from the forks downward. And I've labeled in purple just some of the features at the top and the bottom of this stretch. You have the forks up at the northern end. The Evergreen Brickworks is a site that has been rehabilitated from the industrial past of the valley, and now is a sort of a space for public events and activities. There's a wetlands in there. It's quite a treasure. And then down at the bottom you have the Don Mouth, which is where the Don River flows into the harbor, and that's subject to a project. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. And I marked two things in red. The one in the middle is the layover, the proposed layover site. So you can see it runs for about 1.5 kilometers right up the valley. You can't really tell it from that map, but the actual sort of parkland there is quite narrow because it's bounded on one side by the Don Valley Parkway, and the other side by Bayview Avenue and the Richmond Hill GO line, which is another rail line operational in the valley. The layover is supposed to occupy a disused CP rail line that goes up the east side of the valley. So that's the site we're talking about today. I mark also on the map towards the top of it, you see a red line, which is the Ontario line proposed subway route, and they recently announced that they would be starting to clear the vegetation there for that crossing, as well as one farther up. That's a separate issue. It's I'm not going to go into that in to any length. We're just going to focus on the layover. The layover itself, as I've already mentioned, the proposal has now been scrapped and they're moving it elsewhere. So at least one section of the lower Don has been, for now, safeguarded from reindustrialization. This gives you a little bit of an idea of what Metrolinx had been proposing. These are the two renderings that the main two that they would speak to. One of them shows some buildings nestled alongside the Don Valley Parkway. In quite a narrow spot, you don't have much of a perspective, but the park has become fairly narrow here. And this is a slope that goes down from the Don Valley Parkway to where the current trail is. And then the river is just beyond that. And then they would reactivate approximately 1.5 kilometers of track along the edge of that. And they would also add an inspection road alongside the track. And then in conjunction with the facility, there would be access roads, parking, embankments, retaining walls, fencing, lighting, and so on. The lower rendering gives you a sense of a well-disguised facility, partly just because of the perspective provided. It's hidden behind the rendered vegetation, and we didn't think that really gave you much of a sense of what to expect. So here's some different views that were produced along, by people involved with this effort. The first is a rendering of the actual buildings, and that gives you a sense of the scale of the buildings, and in particular, approximately a 10-meter retaining wall on top of which the buildings would be constructed, and then the train line beyond that. And it really does loom and impose substantially over the accessible part of the Valley Parkland. And then the other rendering shows you a depiction of what we anticipated would be affected or cleared as part of the works on the southern section of this site. And again, this is where it narrows down to the southern part of approaching Riverdale, where the channelized section of the Don commences. So the parkland narrows to a funnel here, and the general sense of people looking at this was that the layover construction and facility would really dominate that. So some of the issues that were really concerning the general public when they heard about this was, they're listed here. I mean, inadequate transparency and consultation, design and site selection issues, and then the impact on the natural habitats and the green space, in contravention or in sort of contradiction to all these visions, like 40 Steps to a New Dawn, bringing back the Don, the ravine strategy of the city, the Don Valley Super Park. There's been announcements over the years. This seemed to go directly in the face of that. So 50 years of progress, not to mention all the government strategies and priorities for retaining green space, building accessible parkland, planting trees, and so on. So there are lots of things that people objected to about this. And at the end of the day, I think many of the opponents weren't that hopeful that this effort would be successful, because there's not a great track record in getting Metrolinx to change its mind. So part of the thinking was, let's just push back to make sure that if they're really going to put that facility in a place like the Don Valley, that at least they can justify why it really has to go here. And if that's the decision, then so be it. But also, let's make them think twice before they decide to encroach further on the Don Valley or similar in ravines elsewhere. They shouldn't be the path of least resistance, and it really shouldn't be about transit or parkland. Both are critical. Both are sort of, essential for the future of the city. And let's find a way to ensure that we do justice to both. So those are some of the aspects of the opposition. The challenges were numerous. I mean, you're dealing with Metrolinx, which has tremendous powers. There's legislative and regulatory frameworks that really does give Metrolinx tremendous prerogatives to proceed and exercise authorities, and they have particular environmental requirements that they meet that are not strictly under the purview of the Conservation Authority, as might be the case for other project proponents. They sponsor an environmental review. It's signed off by the minister, I guess the provincial minister of the environment. This is also overseen by the provincial minister of transportation, because Metrolinx is a provincial agency. But to the extent the province backs them to proceed with something, it's very hard to stand in their way. And a very common reaction was, this is really a done deal. Why are we spending time opposing this? There's a great lack of public awareness of something that we think would have a very significant impact on the Don Valley, which really spoke to the adequacy of the consultation that had occurred. On a number of occasions, people working on the opposition would go down and hand out leaflets in the valley at some point, and at least half the people had never heard of it, and the other half who had heard about it, or less than half, thought it was a crazy idea or just was completely ridiculous. So that sort of encouraged all of us to carry on, that we really should continue to push on this. You always hit the NIMBY, which means not in my backyard, which is, I don't think that's really a fair criticism, because I think there always should be a process for balancing local concerns with broader public interest requirements. And I think when you'd simply put a NIMBY label on something, it hopes to just preempt that discussion. And I think in the case of much of what Metrolinx does, there's really not that much good two-way consultation going into it. The chair or CEO of Metrolinx said that they take it upon themselves to figure out the best transit solution, and then they'll consult on implementation. And I think, just to illustrate further, they didn't even share their thinking about alternative sites with the city when asked at an early stage in the consultation. Another complication on the NIMBY front about the Don Valley is that it really literally isn't anybody's backyard. Maybe it's everybody's because it's out there, but it's in a way, can be hard to generate a collective response to this, because it is somewhat remote to where any individual lives. So that was something that had to be sort of dealt with. Similarly, just avoiding any sense of being anti-transit, because I think most people who are passionate about the Don Valley really want to see transit improvement. So it's a hope that both can be done justice, ongoing transit investment at the same time preserving scarce and precious green space. A final issue that I cite is just the fact that there's a bit of an overload going on in concern about environmental issues. We're constantly hearing about what's going on with the green belt, with conservation authorities, with new highways, with the trees at Osgood Hall or Moss Park, with Smalls Creek, et cetera, et cetera. And I think perhaps everybody doesn't know exactly where to apply one's effort, because it's easy to just sort of feel overwhelmed by everything that's going on. At the same time, it's extremely, I guess, helpful that groups are taking it upon themselves to just try to make sure that we're striking the right balance between whether it's transit and environment or other developments. I mean, at Ontario Place, you have a spa, which is slightly less convincing than a transit investment, but we won't get into that. Very briefly, in terms of what the campaign really encompassed, and I won't, there's a lot of campaigns going on, think of Smalls Creek or Osgood or the couple of highway proposals. There's very broad campaigns going on, and we had a lot to learn from all of them. I don't think we sort of got to the point where many of them were, but for some reason, and we'll speculate about reasons, but for some reason this one had a good outcome. But I think there's a lot of other people who are showing best practices about really how to spread awareness and knowledge and get people energized about trying to revisit some of these decisions. Anyway, as I said, the goal of this is really just to ostensibly get them to revisit plans for the layover, but short of that, to send a message that these things shouldn't be done lightly, or it shouldn't be viewed as the path of least resistance, just building in the ravine. In terms of the sort of the content of the campaign, a few things that were emphasized in a lot of the communications. One was balancing transit improvements with other policy goals, recognizing every step of the way that transit is important and it has to happen. But let's make sure that the discussions at every step also recognize the critical importance of urban green space. I mean, they don't make that anymore. It's all the more important when you think about, the impact of climate change on the city and the loss of biodiversity. These things are just, it's heartbreaking to think that we would be, consuming our ravines for industrial or other goals when it can possibly be avoided. We spent a lot of time sort of debating or looking at alternative sites because at least putting up some suggested alternatives is a necessary part of the discussion. So you're simply not viewed as mindlessly opposing something, even though I think in this case, just outright opposition for using the valley is certainly an important part of the argument. Coming back to the issue of renderings as well, we always thought it was interesting that Metrolinx was very reluctant to share a wider set of renderings, which had been their response to the people at the city liaising with them. I found that very surprising and perhaps telling that this thing was perhaps going to have a much bigger impact than a lot of people thought. So an emphasis on, show us the renderings, or here's what we think it's going to look like. And when people looked at that, they were quite shocked. So I think that's a fruitful avenue. We were gradually, I guess, building up awareness and support for this over time. I thought we still had a little ways to go. Timing was uncertain, as I've already mentioned. We thought they could have gotten the chainsaws out as early as this spring. That being said, they were in the limbo of the detailed design phase. So we thought maybe we had a little bit more time to work and continue to ramp up our efforts and draw attention to what's being proposed for the valley. A few more things that were sort of targets for our efforts. People working on this campaign did work to engage with all three levels of government. The provincial government is the one that has most control over Metrolinx, but every sign is that they've been backing Metrolinx and really just want to get these transit projects done. And to some extent that's understandable, but it is trampling roughshod on a lot of very important values that people in the city all share. The federal government has some opportunities to weigh in. There's a federal process for environmental assessments. They had been, for whatever reason, reluctant to engage in that. Perhaps they do it, they do it very selectively. One thing they've just done actually on the Greenbelt plans in the Rouge areas, they've just announced, I think this week, that the federal government would do an environmental assessment of part of the plans for the Greenbelt. So that's sort of that's somewhat exceptional. City Council was key in our view. Paula Fletcher, a councillor for the Riverdale area, showed a lot of leadership in terms of putting motions before council and working with the Transit Expansion Office. And many people involved in the campaign were happy to encourage her and provide input and demonstrate public sentiment about this. So I think that was a useful collaboration. There's a fair amount of on-site outreach in terms of showing up at events and raising awareness, handing out material. And we also communicated with the Metrolinx board. So one thing we did was a few things. An open letter to Metrolinx signed by many environmental organizations and neighborhood organizations, as well as mobilizing. Metrolinx would have open public publicized or broadcast board meetings, and you could send representations to them, and they would reference them. So we had quite a few people sending representations to the Metrolinx board. So they were well aware of the sentiment about this, as they would be about so many other sites that they're working on. We did a similar thing with City Council, where you can provide deputations to a committee or council, where you show up and you read a statement and answer questions. And you could also mobilize people to send in submissions. And for one of the City Council meetings or Infrastructure and Environment Committee meetings, we had several hundred people all send in their own messages and views about the proposal. So I think that was quite a useful thing to do. Our website and social media activities were not particularly advanced, but we were working on that. We had a website, Twitter, getting things out, but I think that was in the process of ramping up. And then we did have a sort of we established a fund with the Small Change Fund, which is a a service that will assist projects, environmental projects and other projects to fundraise. So that was instrumental in the efforts of the campaign. Now, those of us involved with this, on March 1st, we probably all remember where we were, because the emails started circulating that Metrolinx was about to announce something, and it seemed to be that they were changing their plans, and lo and behold, they came out with that. So that was just earlier in this month, and I still remain surprised that just all of a sudden this changed, because they had been quiet for a few months. As I mentioned, they were engaged with the contractors who would be working on this part of the Go expansion project in the detailed design phase of this. And then out of the blue, this happens. So it's something that, was very much greeted as good news. They apparently have found another site in what they call a light industrial area near Leslie Street and York Mills. And if you look at the site on the map, it seems to be less problematic than the intrusion on the Don, far less problematic than the intrusion on the Don Valley that had been contemplated. Why this option wasn't considered from the outset is a mystery, but be that as it may, this is what was announced. Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, they did announce that they would be proceeding on clearing some of the vegetation in the Don Valley for the Ontario line. And I showed on the map earlier where that is. It's sort of running north from Pate, right across the valley. It'll be for a crossing. And then if you continue along through Thorncliffe Park, there'll be another crossing. It'll have a fairly significant impact on the vegetation. And it's part of the impact of the Ontario line. And I think it would have been great if there had been more consultation about the actual impact and plans for vegetation. That announcement came out of the blue as well. I actually went by it today, and the work has started. It's early days and hard to say exactly what the impact of that will be. But, it's, I think it's something where there's just less flexibility than with a layover. I think a layover, which is basically a siding, a parking facility, they can go at various places around the network, and then there's some intrinsic flexibility. In fairness, I think there's somewhat less flexibility in terms of where the Ontario line goes, and we've heard people expressing dismay about the local impact of the Ontario line, whether you're talking about various places on Queen Street or Osgood or Moss Park or Thorncliffe Park, and that pain will be continuing for the next decade, and we'll also be hearing about the price tag. The project costs have already gone from 10 or 11 to about 18 or 19 billion, and we probably haven't heard the last of that. I think the emphasis on the Ontario line from an accountability standpoint would really be aiming to hope they minimize the cutting necessary, impact on habitats in the Don Valley, and also very strong remediation and restoration, and ensure that the valley is left better off once those works are completed. I'll speculate very briefly about exactly what went on in this decision for the layover. And I'd like to think it was the forcefulness of the campaign and the persuasiveness of the arguments and materials that were provided. And who knows? I mean, some people involved, not from the Metrolinx side, but who were up close, thought that the clear public pressure and public inclination in this case had an impact on the decision. That's hopefully it was a positive impact. Why Metrolinx heeded public sentiment here and not in other places in the same way, who knows what factored into their decision. It may be that as they worked on detailed design phase, they encountered challenges in terms of building in the lower Don site. I mean, there's issues of floodplain, there's a very big slope, there's a substantial rehabilitation of the track bed and the bridge. So maybe it turned out more challenging or more expensive than they thought. One factor that people have mentioned is There is discussion of high frequency rail, a line that would go from Toronto to Ottawa and Montreal. And there's been discussion about using that for the valley, using the valley for that line. That's a possibility. That's some years off. And that's, I guess, a future issue to be looked at. Just like the GO expansion, high frequency rail has a potential important role to play, but I guess it's very early days on that. Was the layover decision a concession of sorts? I mean, Metrolinx is bumped up against a lot of opposition in a lot of areas. Maybe they saw one area of flexibility here and a concession was made. Maybe it's because there was just that much more flexibility and some of the arguments resonated, they looked elsewhere. Or maybe it just came down to the fact that they didn't need additional grief right now, given all the other things that they're working on. And maybe one other issue is that the overall GO expansion plan is fairly wide-ranging. It's putting in place much more frequent service across the GO network, so-called 15-minute two-way service. It's a substantial multi-billion-dollar project with sites all over the network, and it's got an ambitious sort of impact on ridership. I think the impact is some multiplication of ridership by, say, 2031. I think they were aiming to triple GO system ridership over pre-pandemic levels by 2031. I think from mid-2022, they were at 50% of pre-pandemic levels for overall ridership. So it may be that there was an element of, they can hold off and getting the layover in that particular place immediately is not an immediate, an urgent priority. So they have flexibility to look elsewhere in the system. Just if thoughts on lessons from this episode. From my perspective, I'm not a seasoned environmental campaigner. This just tells me you never know. If you feel strongly about something and there's some good arguments or questions that aren't well addressed, getting together with other people and trying to at least figure out whether those questions have good answers and what the right thing to do is. Again, it seems to me that recognizing everybody's only got, you have to pick and choose your battles. But I think, again, a lesson for me is you never know. Another lesson I found is that once you delve into these things, what looks like a fairly strong case just raises all kinds of issues. So delving into their environmental project review, which is this report, environmental project report, which the process requires it. It's dozens of volumes and thousands of pages. You see all kinds of sort of things that you just wonder about, or basically they raise more questions than they answer, and it sort of encourages you to forge ahead. So those are some of the takeaways that I sort of saw from this effort. Let me talk very briefly about the future of the Lower Don. I think this just puts us back slightly more on track in terms of fulfilling the vision that many have had in past years, including the people from the Lower Don Task Force that Bill King mentioned. There are templates and designs and visions that the city and others have put forward. And I think this is a great opportunity to revisit those and recommit to those, addressing the need for accessible green space on the one hand, and preservation of natural habitats and climate, and the role of green space in climate change mitigation. So I think it's a great opportunity to just relook at the Lower Don as a great place to pursue those goals, with the added benefit that it's an iconic place of the Toronto urban landscape. I mean, it really is a striking, unique feature of Toronto, and it's I think it's something that people should be thinking big about. You know, let's really improve it and see what it can become. At the same time, you have to acknowledge that every day in the news we hear about city budgetary pressures and pressures arising from population growth and demographics. So this isn't going to be an easy effort, but I think there's a lot of good things that can be done. And I think it starts with just recommitting to a vision for the Lower Don. That's relatively available. They have a master plan for the Lower Don. It was refreshed in 2019. I think you can build on that because now there are additional possibilities like what to do with that CP rail line that had been proposed for the layover. So I think recommitting to a vision for the Lower Don, and I think an important feature that could be a more significant role for Indigenous communities. They're really, I think, they have a lot to offer in terms of stewardship and the history and the places on the river. And when you look at the proposed name for the Lower Don Parklands is the Wanscotinach Parklands, and that is an Anishinaabe word for burning bright point. I believe that's one translation, which was a way that part of the river was described historically. It's one of the names that was used for it. So I think that's an important part of what the vision for the Lower Don should include, and an element of significant element of Aboriginal-led stewardship. And so, but stewardship generally is something that we can all take on. There's so many groups rolling up their sleeves on an ongoing basis to work in the Don, and I'd include paddlers in that. We had a great outing last October, and I think it's nice to think that part of the work or part of the experience of the Wilderness Canoe Association can be appreciating the wilderness closer at hand and ensuring that it thrives as part of the city environment, because it's pretty critical. And the Don is one of many places nearby that we can all enjoy. We've got the Humber and the Rouge and other places as well. Now, as an added bonus, I just want to point to the significant effort that's being done at the mouth of the Don. Those of you who have paddled the Don in past years, you come down, that's the left side. You see the mouth of the Don as it is currently. It's quite sorry. When rivers take 90-degree angles, it's a bad sign. So you're going down a concrete trench with a lot of industrial stuff in it, and then you turn right towards the west in what's Keating Channel, and paddle the Don would typically, in years gone by, pull out somewhere on Villiers Island, which is that sort of mixed old industrial area just south of the red line of the river. I think Keating Channel was built in the 1890s or something there or 1900. They're always looking at ways to deal with the Lower Don because there was a lot of swampland and flooding was an issue and sediment was an issue. So they tried various things, none of which worked terribly well. So what they're doing right now, and it's in the works, is they're renaturalizing the Lower Don. And on the right side, you see a new path for the river, which will come out through parkland and into an existing channel, but it will be a more natural wetland environment. So part of this is renaturalization of the Don, and part of it is flood control. So you can see that there'll be the Don Channel, the Keating Channel will still be available, and there'll be booms that will allow flooding to go down there. But also the channel, if you follow the river path due south, there's an overflow channel as well. So this is all conceived to mitigate the impact of flooding on the Lower Don mouth area, and then there will be development, commercial, residential development in that area. The main section there is Villiers Island. Now, another thing in the news is also the Gardiner Expressway, and you can see the ramp here, which is leading from the Gardiner Expressway up north towards the Don Valley, and that's perhaps something that will be revisited in the context of the current mayoral election. So people can just stay tuned for that, and perhaps follow that debate and see what sort of is the best way to weigh the interests of cars and residential development and preservation of the integrity of the Don River itself. That concludes my remarks. So I've raced through it. Thank you for your patience. I would be delighted to hear comments or questions on any of the things that I've discussed or other observations about these assets we have in our city, our ravines and rivers.
I have a question, Tom.
Hi, Lee.
Hi there. Thanks very much for that presentation and congratulations. You talked about the critical need for stewardship and talked about the involvement of paddlers, and that you had done the paddle last fall. What if we made that an annual event and actually invited some of the did I say that? The Metrolinx members and politicians and maybe some environmental groups and indigenous communities, and tried to make that an annual thing, but invite the enemy, as it were, to see how valuable the resource is.
Well, I think it's great to think about just drawing attention to that, because when you paddle the river, you see it from a completely different perspective. And I think it would demonstrate how, that it's something that could be put to better use, and both from it could be preserved or supported better, and also something that could be enjoyed by residents of the city, whether you're talking about the Don or the Humber or what have you. One thing I was a bit encouraged by is that in the Lower Don Trail Master Plan, there are actually 3 canoe launch sites. I think there's one at the Forks, and one at Pottery Road, and one at the down at the Corktown Common. And I don't know, there's all these elements in that plan, and I think it would be wonderful to have those, and then hopefully people would use them and become more of an active part of the life on the river. But I would certainly be delighted to talk with people about doing some kind of event. I know we'll certainly have future outings in the Toronto area on this and on the Don and other rivers, but to the extent we can coax other people, and Metrolinx, who bless their hearts are they're doing their best to deliver transit, and it would be great for them to have a firsthand view about how how it looks from the river, and maybe that makes them think a little bit more about things. So something to consider.
I think people who don't know something can't protect it. So when kids grow up looking at their screens and they don't know what a forest is like, they're not going to try and protect a forest. They'll protect cell towers. So, getting someone into a river and people finding out that it's a really wonderful, magical place to be when you have cities surrounding you, and you didn't know that you could only get into the river and be away from the city, makes it even more magical, and people will be more likely to protect it if they know it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the Portland's redevelopment, if you look at the renderings of that, they show kayaks and canoes and people on the banks of the river. Everything's pointing towards more engagement with the supposedly 250,000 people in Toronto live within reasonable proximity of the Lower Don, and so this is a wonderful opportunity to improve the accessible parkland, and use of the river should certainly be part of that.
Yeah, Tom, we talked about last fall when we went and did the Don to incorporate some other outings in the area and do the Inner Harbor, Humber River, Pickering, Oshawa, etc. So that was talked about. And we just need members to basically launch events, basically, right?
Okay.
I've become an official day trip leader with Orca, so I'll have to volunteer, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah,
Well, Lee,
it's
I'm
quite
happy to
easy
work
to set up an outing.
Yeah, no, Lee, I'm happy to work with you on, we can have a little brainstorming and come up with some things because, you know, there's such great excursions to be had. And, you know, for people who live nearby, it's a very nice day out.
Yes.
Tom,
and if
can
it
you
is-
unshare? Like just have
Oh, yeah.
everybody visible?
Yes.
That would be better. Okay. Yeah, I just want to mention, like we've been doing this for a while. We do have outings, and I've been doing like the Oshawa, Whitby, Pickering rivers, you know, Rouge, Duffins Creek, Harmony, etc. And it's kind of like an urban, you know, thing. When you go up the creek in Duffins and Ajax, you're in the wilderness because you're in this notch of a valley. You don't see any houses. And when
Yeah.
we're there, we see fish, deer, all kind of stuff, you know. So it's just something you could do right on Lake Ontario. Just go up one of the marshes. Now, the only little caveat there is there are some marshes protected because of birds in the spring. They usually put a sign up saying don't come in until whatever, July 21st or something. But many little marshes are not protected. And just, you know, you're not doing anything, you're just paddling up them, or a creek. And you could do the same thing in Toronto. There's a lot of beaches you can launch from. So we should think about that.
Absolutely.
Yes, and just even inviting a politician whose would be favorable, like Paula.
Yeah, Bill's
be
got his
good.
finger up.
Yeah, just wanted to inject a small note of caution. The Don is not for most of the year a navigable river, even by canoe, unless you fancy walking along and getting into your canoe from time to time and then walking again. The success of the Don River Day depended on a release of water from the reservoir at the top. And I can recall standing at Serena Gundy Park, waiting for the water to arrive and seeing all of a sudden a difference in a river that would hardly have floated a toy boat and all of a sudden became something that was fun to paddle. So please take that into account if you're planning outings on the river, particularly if you're trying to plan something organized, because Don River Day became increasingly bureaucratic over the years. It involved everybody from the Boy Scouts to the Harbor Patrol to the Coast Guard, and all of the people that were volunteering for the Wilderness Canoe Association had to have police checks. And so you're not talking a minor undertaking if you want to organize an event which you're then going to offer to the public.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll
Yeah,
just offer to one politician at a time and just WACA members.
We had lots of them in the past, including Kathleen Wynne on several Don River
He was a
days.
regular. Yeah, that was a truly massive effort, and I think that it would be extremely daunting for anybody to take that on.
DONTING, in fact.
Well, the Conservation Authority had multiple people donated or were assigned for months of the year to organizing this event. It was a major financial fundraiser for them, but on the other hand, it was a lot of organization. So just don't undersell it.
Yeah. I think the thing we were striving for in the fall was we do an event, and you notice we put a YouTube video. It was very historic. We went up the river, and it was shallow. You had to kind of dig yourself up the river sometimes. But the idea was we posted, here's the put in, here's the parking, anybody can do it. it was just a flat water paddle in essence up the river and then back into the channel. And we, Tom and I talked about, well, we can go to, I don't know, Harborfront next time. We can go to Cherry Beach next time, and you just got to be cautious because the lake could get, wavy. So you'd have to have an out to say, we're going to be in the inner harbor, or going to be going around the island or something, or through the channels. So the idea of the YouTube videos, we always post, this is the put in. So anybody in the public watches the video, they can see a map that says, this is where you go, this is where you park. And we were on Sunday, so there was no parking fee. I don't think there was. Maybe there was. Anyways,
No.
At the end of the day, you just got to keep it simple. So you make the public aware of it by, looking at us saying, yeah, I can do that, because it was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Well done.
Yeah. So I did put the link in the chat. You can check out that video. It's Tom's got a lot of history, and so it was almost like a history lesson going back to the 18 whatevers, 20s or something, as he was pointing out stuff as we were paddling. And there's a lot of history there. There's railway bridges crossing every which way, and abandoned rail services that went out in 20s or the 30s or the 40s. So it was very interesting. The only negative I would say, because the Don Valley's right there, it's loud. So you're in this kind of bubble of wilderness, but you hear this shoop, shoop, shoop of the cars.
Well, especially the lower from Riverdale to Corktown is this channel, which was called, I think, the Don Improvement Project, which nowadays sounds like a pretty lame euphemism. And that was completed in about 1890. And they thought this could be a real commercial conduit. You can have boats going up and warehouses and everything. So they straightened it, and it was a terrible, I think, way over budget. It was just a nightmare, and it never really fulfilled the promise. And now it really needs help. Some things in the Lower Don plan will improve accessibility in that area and perhaps lead to some more greenery. I wonder if there aren't opportunities to be further imaginative, but at the same time, the DVP is there, and then the rail line, the Richmond Hill GO line is there, and those really limit what can be done without some major changes. But I found that once you get north of that, you go under this disused railway bridge, and it's remarkably insulated, as someone was just saying. You do feel like you're in wilderness. You still hear some evidence of the Don Valley Parkway not so far off, but you're really surrounded by towering green space, foliage on both sides.
Because the river is kind of 5 meters down from the shoreline.
Yeah.
So you're in this, a little channel.
But there are a lot of
meandering.
invasives, so a lot of Japanese knotweed there to be dealt with by future stewardship projects.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Tom. This has been excellent. Is there any more questions from the audience? If not, we'll call it an evening.
Someone just actually put a chat question about, was Evergreen involved? And Evergreen is the corporation that has a contract to operate the brickworks. So it's called the Evergreen Brickworks. We were in touch with them, but they didn't really sort of step up in a big way. They have been centrally involved in past plans for the Don. I'm not quite sure what was behind their stance. It might have been the mindset that said, this is something that Metrolinx is doing anyway, and let's just try to make the best of it, as opposed to try and seek another outcome. Anyway, I certainly think Evergreen and the facility has a critical role to play in bringing about a future, fulfilling the vision for the future of the Don. So hopefully we'll see important ongoing contributions from them.
All right. Maybe this is it. Thank you very much, Tom.
Great. Okay.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks a
Bye.
lot. Bye.
website